Los Angeles. The city of dreams, flashing lights, and high-end luxury stores. A place where the rich flaunt their wealth and the poor dream of making it big. It was a bright Saturday afternoon when Shaquille O'Neal, better known as Big Shaq, walked into Crestline Luxury Mall, one of the most expensive shopping centers in the city. A massive man, standing at 7'1", with a presence that could not be ignored. People turned their heads as he entered, some whispering, some pointing, some pulling out their phones to sneak pictures. He was used to it. Fame came with a price. Shaq had been in the NBA, made millions, became a businessman, an actor, a rapper, and even a DJ. His portfolio stretched far beyond basketball. But none of that mattered today. Today, he was just a man looking to buy a few things. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, hit that subscribe button, and turn on notifications so you never miss more inspirational stories like this. Now, let's keep the story going. Dressed in a simple black hoodie, sweatpants, and sneakers, Shaq walked through the aisles, browsing expensive jewelry, designer shoes, and custom-tailored suits. He picked up a $15,000 Rolex watch, a $5,000 Italian leather jacket, and a pair of $3,000 sunglasses. To him, this was nothing, just another shopping spree. But someone was watching him. Eleanor Kensington, the owner of Crestline Luxury Mall, was an elderly white woman in her early 70s, with piercing blue eyes and a face hardened by years of privilege. From the security office, she sat in her leather chair, sipping on her morning coffee, watching the CCTV screens. That's when she saw him. A large black man, casually picking up expensive items. Her lips curled in suspicion. She narrowed her eyes and muttered, "Who does he think he is?" Eleanor had seen this before, or at least, she thought she had. In her mind, rich black men were rappers, drug dealers, or scammers. She never believed they could be successful businessmen, entertainers, or self-made entrepreneurs. Her mind was set in the past, frozen in a time when people like Shaq weren't even allowed to shop in places like hers. Her wrinkled hands tightened around her coffee cup as she picked up the intercom phone. She dialed security. "Get up to the luxury section," she ordered. "We have a situation." "Ma'am?" "There's a big black man walking around like he owns the place. He's either planning to rob us or is involved in some shady business. Either way, he needs to go." There was silence on the other end before the security officer, Dan, responded, Ma'am, I think that's Shaquille O'Neal." "The basketball legend?" Eleanor scoffed. "I don't care if he's the President of the United States. He doesn't belong here." She slammed the phone down, her heels clicking against the marble floors as she stormed toward the luxury section. Shaq was minding his business, browsing through the sleek glass display cases, admiring a platinum bracelet when he heard the unmistakable click-clack of heels approaching. He turned his head slightly, his calm eyes landing on a thin, elderly white woman marching toward him with a face that looked like it had been sculpted out of stone. She was dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, her silver-white hair tucked neatly into a bun. Everything about her screamed old money and authority. But Shaq didn't recognize her. And he didn't care to. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, stopping just a few feet away from him. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the space like a dagger. Shaq turned fully toward her, towering over her like a giant over a doll. "Yeah." Eleanor folded her arms. "I don't know what you're doing here, but I think it's best you leave." Shaq raised an eyebrow. And why would I do that? Eleanor scoffed, shaking her head as if the answer was obvious. Men like you don't belong in places like this. The words hit like a slap, but Shaq kept his face neutral. He had heard things like this before, but he never let them get to him. Men like me, he repeated. Eleanor gestured at the luxury items in his hands. Either you're planning to rob this place, or you're using dirty money. I don't know which one it is, and frankly, I don't care. But I won't have you walking around my mall making my customers uncomfortable. Shaq let out a small laugh, shaking his head. Lady, do you even know who I am? I don't care, she snapped. What I do care about is keeping my business respectable. And that means keeping people like you out. Shaq's fingers curled around the watch in his hand. He took a deep breath, suppressing the irritation rising in his chest. He had been rich longer than most people in this mall had been alive, but to her, he was still just another black man who didn't belong. A few customers had stopped to watch, their eyes darting between Shaq and Eleanor. The tension was thick, and the moment felt suffocating. Just then, 2 mall security guards appeared. They were young, early 30s at most, and looked uncomfortable as they approached. Eleanor turned to them, her voice sharp. Escort this man out of my mall. The taller of the 2 guards hesitated. Ma'am. I really think. I said, escort him out. Shaq shook his head, giving the guards a smirk. Y'all really gonna do this? The shorter guard shifted uncomfortably. Look, man, we know who you are, but we don't want trouble. Shaq nodded, exhaling slowly. I got you. He placed the items he was holding back onto the display case. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The guards didn't even touch him, just followed behind him like shadows. As he reached the exit, he glanced back over his shoulder at Eleanor. She was still standing there, watching him leave like she had just thrown trash out of her store. Shaq didn't say anything. He just left. But in his mind, a plan was already forming. One that would make Eleanor regret every word she just said. Shaq sat in the back of his custom black Rolls-Royce, his massive frame barely fitting in the spacious back seat. The city lights of Los Angeles blurred past the tinted windows as he stared out, deep in thought. He had been through a lot in his life, poverty, struggle, racism, but he had always overcome. He had built himself into a global icon, an empire of businesses, investments, and endorsements. And yet, no matter how rich, how powerful, how famous he became, there were still people like Eleanor Kensington who saw him as just another black man who didn't belong. He wasn't mad. He was disappointed. Shaq pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Yo, Jimmy. What's up, man? The voice on the other end chuckled. Shaq Diesel. What's good, big man? Shaq got straight to the point. I need you to find out who owns Crestline Luxury Mall. There was a short silence. The mall in L.A. Why? Shaq smirked. Because I'm about to buy it. Jimmy, his longtime real estate consultant and business partner, let out a whistle. Damn. You serious? Dead serious. All right, let me do some digging. I'll call you back in a few. Shaq leaned back against the leather seats, a smirk forming on his lips. Eleanor Kensington thought he didn't belong in her mall. She was about to find out just how much he belonged. Shaq was sitting in an executive conference room, a massive table stretching out before him, surrounded by a group of real estate brokers, attorneys, and financial analysts. Jimmy sat next to him, flipping through a thick stack of documents. "All right, big man. Everything's in place. The deal is closed. Crestline Luxury Mall is officially yours." Shaq took the pen in his giant hands and signed the final document with a swift motion. The ink barely dried before he leaned back and laughed. It was done. He owned the mall. Eleanor Kensington no longer had the power. She worked for him now. Jimmy grinned. "So, what's next?" Shaq smiled. Now we pay Eleanor a little visit." Eleanor Kensington adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck, staring down at the clipboard in her hands as she walked through the mall. It had been a week since she had kicked that big black man out, and she hadn't thought about him since. That type didn't belong in places like this. She was checking the monthly reports when a commotion near the entrance caught her attention. She turned to see a group of employees gathered, whispering, pointing, looking nervous. "What's going on?" she demanded, marching toward them. A young sales associate, barely in her 20s, looked up with wide eyes. Ma'am, the new owner is here." Eleanor froze mid-step. She hadn't even met the new owner yet. Whoever it was had bought the mall without even speaking to her. But she had been waiting for their arrival, hoping it was some wealthy businessman she could charm and impress. Straightening her blazer, she lifted her chin. "Where is he?" The girl swallowed. "Right behind you." Eleanor turned slowly. And there he was. Shaquille O'Neal. A 7-foot giant, dressed in an impeccable tailored suit, standing right in the center of her mall, his hands in his pockets, watching her with an amused expression. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. For the first time in a long time, she was speechless. Shaq smiled. "Hey, Eleanor. You remember me?" Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came out. Shaq took a slow step forward. "You told me a black man like me doesn't belong here." He spread his arms out, looking around. "Well, looks like I do now." Silence. The employees were staring, their eyes darting between Shaq and Eleanor, waiting to see what would happen. Eleanor forced a stiff smile. "Mr. O'Neal, I had no idea." Shaq cut her off. "Yeah, I bet you didn't." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably, her face turning pale. Shaq looked around. "Nice place. Real nice. But I think it could use some changes." He turned his gaze back to Eleanor, his deep voice calm but firm. "Starting with management." Eleanor Kensington stood frozen, her pearl-clad fingers gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. Shaquille O'Neal, the same man she had humiliated, disrespected, and thrown out of her mall, was now standing before her as her new boss. The realization hit her like a freight train. This couldn't be happening. She tried to compose herself, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, clearing her throat. I must say, this is quite a surprise." Shaq chuckled, his massive frame towering over her. "Oh, I bet it is." Eleanor shifted nervously. I wasn't informed about the new ownership until now. If I had known, Shaq cut her off. "If you had known, what?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You would have treated me with some respect. You wouldn't have called security on me. You wouldn't have assumed I was a criminal. Eleanor swallowed hard. I was just trying to protect the integrity of my establishment. Shaq arched an eyebrow. Your establishment? Eleanor blinked. Shaq took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. See, that's the thing, Eleanor. This ain't your establishment anymore. A hush fell over the crowd of employees still watching. Some of them were biting their lips to keep from smiling. Eleanor opened her mouth, but Shaq kept going. You thought I didn't belong here. Thought I was just some thug trying to steal. But let me tell you something, this thug just bought the whole damn place. Eleanor's face flushed red, her pride fighting against the reality of the situation. Mr. O'Neal, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I've been managing this mall for over 20 years. I have built its reputation from the ground up. Surely, you don't intend to just... Oh, I do, Shaq said, nodding. See, Eleanor, I don't just buy businesses. I improve them. And to do that, I need the right people running things. Eleanor stiffened. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. And I hate to break it to you, but you ain't the right person. Silence. The words hung in the air. Eleanor's lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. You're firing me. Shaq gave her a long, hard look before saying, I think you fired yourself when you judged me before you even knew me. Eleanor staggered back slightly, like she had been physically struck. Her power, her status, her pride, all of it shattered in a single moment. Shaq took a deep breath. But hey, I believe in second chances. So I'll give you one. Eleanor's eyes lit up with hope. Shaq smirked. There's a janitor position opening up soon. The crowd erupted into muffled gasps and chuckles. Eleanor's face turned ghostly pale. Shaq tilted his head. What? Thought you were too good to clean up around here. Eleanor stammered, shaking her head. This is humiliating. You can't do this. Shaq shrugged. Lady, you did this to yourself. She stared at him, her entire world crashing down. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed off, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Shaq watched her go, then turned to the employees still standing around. All right, y'all, he said, clapping his hands together. Let's make some changes around here. The buzz around Crestline Luxury Mall spread like wildfire. By the next day, everyone in the mall knew what had happened. Employees whispered in break rooms, customers gossiped near the fountains, and social media was on fire with the news that Shaquille O'Neal had bought the mall and fired its longtime owner, Eleanor Kensington. Some thought it was justice well served. Others thought it was karma in its purest form. But one thing was clear, things were about to change. Shaq stood on the top floor of the mall, looking down from the glass railing at the bustling activity below. The energy in the mall was completely different from when he first walked in weeks ago. For starters, there were more diverse customers. People who once felt unwelcome were now walking through the high-end stores, shopping freely, without being watched like criminals. Shaq had made big changes. He fired staff who had the same mentality as Eleanor. He hired new managers who understood customer service, respect, and inclusivity. He launched business mentorship programs to help small minority-owned brands get their products in luxury stores. He increased wages for mall employees who had been underpaid for years. And he started a community scholarship fund, giving back to kids who wanted to pursue business, entrepreneurship, or sports. Crestline Luxury Mall wasn't just a high-end shopping spot anymore. It was a symbol of opportunity. Not everyone had a happy ending. Eleanor Kensington refused the janitor position, of course. Instead, she tried to fight back. Threatened a lawsuit, reached out to investors, even attempted to stir up a boycott against Shaq's ownership. But she failed miserably. No one came to her rescue. The investors didn't care. The board members didn't care. Even her closest allies in the business world distanced themselves. They didn't want to be associated with someone who had been exposed for their outdated, racist behavior. In a matter of weeks, Eleanor went from being the queen of the mall to a forgotten footnote in its history. And she knew it. One afternoon, Shaq was in his office when his assistant buzzed in. "Mr. O'Neal, Eleanor Kensington is here. She's asking to see you." Shaq leaned back in his chair. "She say why?" "No, sir." Shaq smirked. "Let her in." Moments later, the door opened, and Eleanor walked in. She looked different, less polished, more tired, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. She stood there for a moment, then sighed. "You won." Shaq studied her for a second. Then he nodded. "I did." Eleanor swallowed hard. I misjudged you. And I regret that." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You regret what? Misjudging me or losing your power?" Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Shaq didn't need her to answer. He already knew. After a long pause, Eleanor finally said, "I don't expect forgiveness." Shaq leaned forward. "Good. 'Cause I don't owe it to you." She stiffened. Shaq exhaled, then shook his head. "Eleanor, you could have been part of this. You could have been part of something bigger. But you let your own hate blind you. And now? You gotta live with that." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if she finally understood. Without another word, she turned and walked out of his office. Shaq didn't watch her leave. He had bigger things to focus on. That night, Shaq walked through the mall, stopping near the center fountain. A group of kids were playing near the water, laughing, posing for pictures under the giant chandelier hanging from the ceiling. An elderly black woman sat on a bench, watching them with a smile. She noticed Shaq and gave him a nod. He nodded back. This was what mattered. Not the money. Not the revenge. But changing the game. Making sure the next generation didn't have to go through the same struggles. Shaquille O'Neal had turned a moment of disrespect into a lifetime of impact. And that was worth more than any mall could ever cost.